no travel to the Black Hills would be complete without at least visiting the main attraction, Mount Rushmore. Oh, this must be new. No drones. Can't fly drones up there. Figures. It's good that we got here after Labor Day because the level of tourists very, very low.
Mount Rushmore is probably the most iconic monument of the Midwest. It's one of the more exemplary monuments we have in the U.S. that I believe we should put on our money. I believe the U.S. has really boring money. The monument was created by Gutzon Borglum and completed after his death by his son Lincoln Borglum. The time frame it was built in is pretty astounding as well. It was constructed over the course of the Great Depression. Its construction began in 1927 and it was completed just months before Pearl Harbor in October of 1941. The monument campus also serves as a large shrine to the engineering achievement that is Mount Rushmore. Flags are put up to honor all of the U.S. states and territories. I don't like Minnesota's flag. It's just a seal. It's just so bleh. We could do so much better.
How would your face go? You're on Mount Rushmore. Very stoic.
Gabi and I spent our whole visit at the monument listening to the audio tour. Gabi had hers in English, and I had mine in Spanish for us to practice, of course. In an effort to take in everything while listening to the audio tour, I didn't get much footage of the monument in, so I'll just dive right in and tell you an interesting story about each of the 4 presidents that were deemed worthy of being sculpted into Mount Rushmore. The largest and most prominent face on the facade of the monument is none other than George Washington, the first president of the United States. George Washington was the general who won the 13 colonies their independence against the British. He was so popular that many colonists wanted Washington to become a king of the colonies. Washington, however, was a fan of Cincinnatus, the Roman dictator that was given total power over the Roman Republic but gave it all up so he could go back to living on his farm in peace with his family. Washington did the same. He served 8 years and then retired from public service. 1 U.S. state is named after him, our national capital is named after him, as well as 31 counties, 71 civil townships, 12 post-secondary institutions, 4 forts, 1 estate, 6 types of geographical features, 9 parks, 7 bridges or roads, and many other locations outside of the U.S. as well. My favorite story regarding George Washington is the biggest what-if tale of the United States. The entire country of the U.S. as we know it may not have happened at all because of a card game. It's the story of the Battle of Trenton. The year was 1776. Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, George Washington, had been suffering loss after loss after loss. One thing Washington knew to do was to retreat when it was warranted. Guerrilla campaigns from militiamen across the colonies had made problems for the British, but the colonists had yet to make any major victories in the field against their colonizers, the British. Because of these defeats, morale was low. What made matters even worse is that it was the month of December. It was cold, many soldiers had no shoes, and their date to re-enlist was approaching. At the end of the month, it would be the end of the year, and the colonial soldiers could choose to re-enlist for another year or take their pay and leave. Washington even had his doubts about winning the war. He had explained in a letter to his cousin, John Washington, that, "I think the game is pretty near up, principally to the accursed policy of short enlistments and placing too great a dependence on the militia." This is when things get interesting. Scouts had confirmed that there were at least 1,500 Hessians garrisoned at the city of Trenton across the Delaware River from the encampment. Hessians were German mercenaries hired by the British Crown to help with the war effort in the colonies. Washington decided to make his move the day after Christmas, December 26, 1776, right before the re-enlistment date. He crossed the Delaware with every man he could spare, which was about 2,400 men. This also brought about the famous painting, The Crossing of the Delaware, by Emanuel Lutz. A Hessian scout had noticed that Washington's forces were nearby and crossing the river. The scout had given his report in a sealed envelope to a runner who ran to Trenton to give his commander the news. The report was to be read by the Hessian commander, but he was busy drinking and playing a card game. The runner left the scout's report on the table next to the commander, who never read it. Washington's forces were able to attack the Hessian garrison in Trenton with their guard down, and they ended up capturing 1,000 men with no reports of Washington losing a single man in the fighting. Morale had skyrocketed among the Continental soldiers as well as the colonies themselves. Word had spread throughout the colonies and more men had enlisted for the year of 1777. Washington's forces had been bolstered once again with fresh recruits while retaining his already battle-hardened soldiers. The United States as we know it today was arguably created in part by a Hessian soldier not checking an envelope and putting his men on guard for an attack. Just behind Washington on the monument is Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president of the United States. During the War for Independence, he was the wartime governor of Virginia, the most populated U.S. colony. He drafted the Declaration of Independence, which was signed on July 4, 1776. The document was a testimony voted on by the Continental Congress that the colonies were no longer a part of Great Britain. The Declaration has also written one of the most influential sentences in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence not only affected the United States. Countries around the world used it as inspiration for their own revolutions in government against their monarchies, most notably in France and in Russia. Over the next few centuries, the following countries also used the Declaration of Independence as the framework for their own revolutionary movements. When Thomas Jefferson was president, he also doubled the territory of the United States through the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon in France. Fortunately for Napoleon, a failure to put down a revolt in Saint-Domingue and a new war brewing with England prompted Napoleon to sell the territory. The U.S. was originally just asking for New Orleans and the surrounding territory, but quickly jumped on that. The purchase itself was pretty controversial at the time. Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark expeditions that mapped much of the West all the way to the Pacific Ocean. To the other side of the monument, we turn to Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. Abraham Lincoln deserves a spot on the monument because of how he had kept the country together during the biggest test the nation ever had, the U.S. Civil War. He is also credited with having freed the slaves by pushing the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which permanently outlawed slavery. In addition, instead of total punishment against the rebel South, Lincoln pushed Reconstruction in an attempt to reunite the nation by reconciliation in the face of bitter opposition. I have an interesting bit regarding the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order signed on New Year's Day in 1863. Although we associate the directive as what had freed the slaves, it had only done a portion of that. What it had done, however, was create a process where all escaped slaves from the Confederate States would now become free. It did not compensate owners, outlaw slavery, or give citizenship to ex-slaves. The complicated bit is that there were several slave states that had not joined the Confederate States of America. Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri still had legalized slavery, but had not rebelled and fought against the North. The slaves in these states, which were still a part of the Union, were not freed. It would take almost 3 more years until the 13th Amendment would pass and slavery was made illegal throughout the entirety of the United States and its territories. The last 2 states to wait until the amendment was passed were the northern states of Kentucky and Delaware. At that time, only a handful of other countries still had slavery legalized in the Americas: the Spanish Captaincy General of Cuba and Puerto Rico, Paraguay, and the Empire of Brazil. Before Lincoln had won the war, the nation was regularly referred to as these United States. The Civil War put an end to much of that, and moving forward, the country was known as the United States. Oh yeah, you know what time it's for.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was the 26th president, serving the first full terms of the 20th century. The reason why this man is my favorite president. He was a conservationist, the father of the modern American West, and he pushed the United States into the 20th century by creating a progressive era that spawned the 40-hour work week, unions, minimum wage, and public investment to bring about the end of the Gilded Age. Teddy was born a sickly and weak child with awful bouts of asthma, born to a wealthy family. Despite his physical hindrances, he was energetic, sociable, and inquisitive. He learned taxidermy at a young age and started his own makeshift museum. He displayed the animals that he had caught or killed after studying them. In his teens, he found out he could diminish the side effects of his asthma through strenuous exercise. He learned how to box, and he focused on fitness throughout much of his life. Roosevelt also had a ranch in the Dakota Territory where he had learned how to ride horses Western style, rope and hunt, and he had also earned the respect of the authentic Western American cowboy. He became a police commissioner of the New York City police force, which is one of the most corrupt at the time. Roosevelt's disdain and mistrust for unethical public service reformed the police force through routine firearm exams, routine mental and physical exams. Of the century in 1898, the U.S. went to war with Spain. After already being in the New York National Guard for years, Roosevelt enlisted and formed a volunteer cavalry regiment named the Rough Riders. He was promoted to colonel and led them to 2 major victories against the Spanish in Cuba. Or he became the governor of New York, then later the vice president of the United States. As acting vice president, visiting the Minnesota State Fair, Roosevelt aroused his supporters by publicizing his most popular maxim, "Speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far." It was a defining motto of his foreign policy. After President McKinley was assassinated by a lone anarchist, Roosevelt assumed the presidency, beginning a new era of American progressivism. Since he was a child, Roosevelt had a respect for nature, so as president he created the National Park, Forest, Monument, and Reserve systems. Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Russo-Japanese War. It was the first major victory by an Eastern power against a Western empire. The Russian Empire would continue to decline until the fall of the Tsardom during World War I, and Japan would continue to spread into a vast empire until its defeat in World War II. In 1903, after Colombia refused to create a canal in Panama for the U.S., Roosevelt applied political pressure to the Panamanian political class and helped Panama gain independence. The new Panamanian government sold the land for the Panama Canal that would be created by 1914. Roosevelt visited Panama in 1906 to see the canal's progress, becoming the first U.S. president to travel abroad while in office. The one thing I personally admire most about Roosevelt were his antitrust laws. The Gilded Age of America was particularly rough through the 1870s to 1900. Large corporate interests ruled in Washington, most notably steel, banking, meat, copper, coal, sugar, oil, and railroad trusts. Trusts were in essence monopolies. These corporations stamped out all competition in the U.S. and set prices high and paid their workers very low wages. This was also during the age that many Europeans emigrated to the U.S., my Irish ancestors included. These trusts took advantage of immigrant labor and used their power as a source of corruption. Although the United States was on the verge of becoming a world industrial power, the common families and people of the U.S. struggled. Regulations to protect workers were low, and safety standards were almost non-existent. Most Americans worked 12 to 14-hour days. This brought about a progressive movement. Unions began to form, as well as laws to protect them, and the fight for the 40-hour work week, holidays, minimum wage, and women's suffrage was on. Teddy Roosevelt was known as the Trust Buster. He dissolved 18 trusts, including the largest railroad syndicates and Standard Oil. Because of his progressive actions, many elites in Washington stood to lose. The Republican Party began to split, so when Roosevelt ran for president for his 3rd term, he started his own progressive party, the Bull Moose Party. While campaigning in Wisconsin, an assassination attempt was made on his life. He was shot in the torso during a speech. Before the bullet had entered into his chest, it had slowed down by penetrating his steel eyeglass case. After being shot and declined requests to go to the hospital, his opening statement to the crowd was, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He continued his speech for another hour. He would carry the bullet in his chest for the rest of his life. He unfortunately lost his bid for president. The bullet in his chest hindered him from strenuous exercise and he began to gain weight. To keep busy, he went onto a surveying and biological expedition into the Amazon rainforest. His objective was to trace a river named the River of Doubt. Upon mapping it, it was named the Roosevelt River. A few years later, his health began to deteriorate, and Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep in his bed in 1919. His son telegraphed his siblings, "The old lion is dead," and Woodrow Wilson's vice president stated, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." Roosevelt was a very controversial figure to add to Mount Rushmore at the time. He hadn't even been dead 10 years when the construction had began. From his days reforming the New York City police force to his trust-busting at corporations holding sway over Washington, Roosevelt was a model of unwavering patriotism which was personified in his disdain for corruption and the nefariously unethical. In the days where establishment politicians are ruled by corporate interests by the 2010 Citizens United decision, I know both sides of the aisle could agree that we need a trust buster like Teddy now more than ever.